Good day. Today's lecture is devoted to effective methods of teaching at university. This topic is of particular importance because university instruction must do more than transmit information. It must also organize thinking, guide intellectual independence, and prepare students for professional action. Therefore, the question of method is not secondary. On the contrary, it determines how knowledge is presented, how it is assimilated, and how it is later applied in academic and professional contexts. At the outset, the slide presents two aims of pedagogical organization. First, it is necessary to understand the core types and internal mechanics of passive teaching methods. Second, it is equally important to master the classification of methods in relation to student-teacher interaction. This is a meaningful starting point. Before one can choose effective methods, one must first understand how different methods function. Accordingly, pedagogical organization requires not only practice, but also conceptual clarity regarding the structure of educational interaction. The slide on page 3 proposes a two-phase movement from theory to practice. Phase 1 concerns the classification of effective teaching methods on the basis of interaction between teacher and students. Phase 2 turns to the analysis of how these methods are applied in modern educational environments. The sequence is pedagogically well-grounded. Theory provides the framework. Practice tests its value. Thus, effective teaching cannot be reduced either to abstract classification or to unstructured experience. Rather, it depends on their systematic connection. This slide distinguishes three major paradigms: the passive method, the active method, and the interactive method. In the passive model, the teacher acts as the main speaker while the student remains primarily a listener. In the active model, the teacher becomes an organizer and the student a participant. In the interactive model, the teacher serves as a facilitator and the student assumes the role of co-creator. Therefore, the essential difference lies in distribution of intellectual responsibility. The more advanced the paradigm, the more fully the student is drawn into the process of constructing meaning rather than merely receiving it. The diagram on page 5 explains the passive method as a form of directed pedagogical influence. Here, the lecture remains the basic form of university instruction, and the student functions as the object of pedagogical impact. The mechanism is clear: the teacher actively delivers the material, whereas the student passively assimilates it. This does not mean that the passive method is entirely without value. It can provide order, coherence, and large-scale transmission of information. However, its limitations must also be recognized, particularly where deeper engagement and feedback are required. The present slide develops the logic of the passive model by showing the monological relationship between teacher and student. The teacher appears as the main source and controller of knowledge, driving the broadcast of information. The student, by contrast, is expected primarily to remember, assimilate, and reproduce what has been received. Consequently, immediate feedback is weakened, and the student's role remains largely reproductive. This structure may support orderly presentation. Nevertheless, it limits the possibilities of dialogue, independent reasoning, and active intellectual response. This slide refers to the traditional model associated with Johann Friedrich Herbart. Its central aim was to ensure order and clarity in the transfer of mass information. Two elements are especially emphasized: strict pedagogical discipline and highly structured methodological explanation. In historical terms, this model played an important role in organizing instruction. At the same time, from a contemporary perspective, it reveals the strengths and limitations of traditional pedagogy. It offers discipline and systematicity, however. It leaves relatively little room for student initiative and dialogical learning. The explanatory-illustrative method is presented on page 8 as a model centered on assimilation through visual transmission and logical transmission. In practical terms, this means that the teacher provides ready-made knowledge, often through lecture visualization, supported by technical tools, educational presentations, and methodical structuring of information. This method is effective where the objective is to introduce and organize complex material clearly. Nevertheless, its pedagogical nature remains primarily transmissive. Therefore, while it strengthens clarity and system, it must often be complemented by more active forms if deeper independent work is desired. The slide on page 9 distinguishes two modalities of lecture visualization: video lectures and multimedia lectures. Video lectures allow students to revisit complex segments repeatedly and at convenient times, which is especially useful for consolidation and review. Multimedia lectures, by contrast, are designed for interactive computer-based training and are particularly suitable for independent and self-paced exploration. Thus, lecture visualization expands the traditional lecture by increasing accessibility, flexibility, and cognitive support. However, its educational value depends on how effectively visual and digital elements are aligned with pedagogical aims. Here, the reproductive method is described as algorithmic execution. The diagram shows a sequence of instruction, pattern recognition, execution, and comparison to a sample. The core principle is that educational activity is driven by established patterns, rules, and guidelines. This method has a clear pedagogical function. It is especially useful where precision, correct procedure, and reliable repetition are required. Nevertheless, because it is based on following a model, it mainly develops execution according to given standards rather than independent problem formulation. The slide on page 11 adds an important qualification. Although passive delivery has functional limits, rigorous monitoring can transform a simulated lecture material into preparation for future active learning. The diagram illustrates this through oral and written surveys, standardized testing, and independent assignments, all converging toward active learning readiness. Accordingly, monitoring should not be regarded merely as control after instruction. It also serves as a bridge between passive reception and subsequent active engagement. In this sense, evaluation becomes preparatory as well as diagnostic. The first part of Babanski's algorithm, shown on page 12, concerns the optimal choice of methods. The first stage is pathway determination, whether learning should proceed through independent study or under teacher guidance. The second stage is ratio establishment, that is, determining the balance between productive methods as the primary driver and reproductive methods as auxiliary support. This is methodologically significant because it rejects one-sided solutions. Effective teaching depends on proportion and appropriateness rather than on exclusive reliance on a single method. The second part of the algorithm introduces three further stages. Stage 3 concerns logical methods, induction, deduction, analysis, and synthesis. Stage 4 addresses modality integration, including verbal, visual, demonstrative, and practical forms. Stage 5 is motivation, that is, the selection of mechanisms that stimulate student activity and engagement. Therefore, Babanski's model is not concerned merely with classification. Rather, it offers a practical algorithm for combining reasoning, modality, and motivation into one coherent instructional strategy. The final thematic slide presents a holistic view of pedagogical functions in relation to adult learning. The diagram on page 14 places the teacher at the center of several interconnected functions: educational, developmental, organizational, motivational, and professional orientation. Around this stands the broader aim of student general and professional competence. The reference to adult learning is especially important. As the slide notes, adult learners achieve better results when they clearly understand the practical value of their tasks. Consequently, university teaching must connect content with purpose and method with professional relevance. Thank you for your attention. I hope this lecture has clarified the logic of effective teaching methods at university and has shown how passive, reproductive, and more productive approaches may be combined in a pedagogically sound manner.